There's a famous case that you've probably heard of in which a guy actually weighed dying humans and found that when they died, their bodies lost on average 21 grams of weight, which is the equivalent of about an ounce. This is a very famous experiment. It's been, touted as proof that the soul leaves the body, and others have dismissed it as being junk science. It was done in, I think, 1902, but I think it was published in 1907 by a guy named Duncan McDougall. Duncan McDougall from Massachusetts, a physician, and he managed to get six human subjects to agree to be weighed right as they were dying. I think most of them had tuberculosis. And most people have dismissed this as being, not that it was like a scam or anything, but that the guy just didn't have enough good technological control on the weighing, on the scales, and also whether or not he evaluated the evidence properly. But that was the famous case. And so today, this is a topic that our own Patreon subscribers chose for us. We gave them a series of options, and because they subscribe on Patreon, they got to vote. And y'all voted on the question of what is the soul and does it exist? And one of the things that's sort of disturbing about Duncan McDougall is that he thought to himself, well, humans have souls, but animals do not. And in thinking this, he was basically holding a kind of standard orthodox view from the sort of Western tradition, which is that only humans have souls. He then thought, well, in order to make this a compelling experiment, I should weigh, pun intended, the human evidence against the case of animals, and in particular dogs. So he also then weighed dying dogs. Now, the sad part about this is that he had a hard time finding dying dogs, as one generally does, and he therefore probably killed them. He probably poisoned them, and he did this to 15 dogs. So I don't know if Duncan McDougall has gone to heaven after his soul left his body or not, but I think that might disqualify you. I'm not sure. Others tried to replicate this experiment more recently. For example, there was a sheep farmer, I believe in Oregon, as recently as 2001, and he basically was weighing various animals as they were dying, and he found a difference in their weight. But here's the thing, it didn't really confirm McDougall's experiments because it suggested that that the animals, sheep in particular, were actually gaining weight as they died, which is probably evidence that the scientific instrumentation is not up to snuff, but I find that very amusing. Anyway, that raises all kinds of interesting questions about, do animals have souls? Do human beings have souls? Does the soul actually weigh anything? Like, is it a material thing or is it an immaterial entity? And so today, on Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge, what is the soul and does it exist? Welcome. The soul idea, of course, is very ubiquitous. It's part of the Western tradition from the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also, of course, the soul idea is very strong in Hinduism. It has a very confusing history in Buddhism, which we'll mention later. And it doesn't appear as often, I think, in Chinese formal philosophy like Confucianism, but definitely in the folk cultures of China. And in the folk cultures of Africa and the Americas, you'll see all kinds of soul talk. So it's everywhere through the history and the geography of human populations. What is the function of the soul? Why have people been drawn to this idea? One idea is that it emerged naturally from our ancestors basically dreaming. Imagine you don't have science and you have a very limited conceptual understanding of how the world works, including yourself, but every night you go to sleep and you seem to go to other places and meet friends and family, and then you wake up back in your bed or on the ground next to the fire or whatever it is. And of course, if you didn't have really a theory about how psychology worked, you might think that there was some part of you that was leaving while you were asleep and it coming back. That's actually a pretty reasonable sort of assessment of dreaming. I hasten to add that even though science has gotten way better on psychology, dreaming is still deeply mysterious. I'm not endorsing the soul adventure theory of dreaming. I'm just saying dreaming is still not well understood. That's another show entirely, I think. We need to do something on dreaming. Okay, anyway, back to this plot. So, one of the reasons why people have been attracted to the soul idea is that it provides a kind of repository of your personal identity. It's a way of talking about the essential you. The body changes over time. People will say that every 7 years, all the material of your body from, inside your cells is basically recycled and you have all new energy, matter. So what's holding you together as a sort of independent agent? And maybe historically the soul has done that kind of work. People in the ancient world understood that the body was constantly changing and developing. So maybe there was this non-bodily aspect to you that was your real personality. So that's one way of using the idea of the soul. Two, I think, is that it's the main vehicle for immortality. Everyone knows the body is not immortal, at least outside of certain Christian Orthodox teachings about getting the body back in the afterlife. For the most part, you can see that the body of your dead loved one or your friend is rotting away and becoming worm food. So most religions said there must be a separate part of you that goes on and on and on, either through reincarnation or to heaven or hell. So the soul was a very valuable idea for this immortality adventure that we're all supposed to go on. And I think thirdly, one of the main ideas for people committing to the soul is that it is a way of talking within folk culture about ghosts. I'm not sure what comes first. Does the soul idea come first, and then it's a way of sort of describing ghosts? Or were ghosts sort of a cultural phenomenon that then were connected to our own individual essential selves? You can see how they're sort of related. The ghost that you see like in the graveyard in folk culture or at the burial mounds or whatever in folk culture is basically thought to be a soul that has left the body and has not yet found its way to the other world. And this is common in Eastern thought too. I remember one time I think I was in Thailand or maybe Myanmar, and I was at a temple, and this monk was telling me that there was a female ghost living in the temple altar underneath the Buddha statue, and that this ghost would make a lot of noise at night. And I was asking him, who was it? And he said it was a woman who had died in childbirth very painfully. She was from the local community, and they theorized that she was there sort of causing mischief and trouble because she had had such a difficult death. And this is a common view in Southeast Asia, where women who die in childbirth or men or women who die painful deaths like in war or fighting will come back as ghosts before they can move on. I think it's called a bray, B-R-A-Y, in Southeast Asia, I think in Thailand. So anyway, this is sort of a common way also of thinking about the soul as part of folk cultures of the ghost. But now, is the soul something material, like a kind of fine, vaporous stuff, or is it immaterial? I remember when I was a kid, I used to think that the soul was basically a lot like Casper the Friendly Ghost. Some of you may have seen this classic of animation. Some of it actually did have really good animation, and then some of it got kind of schlocky. Anyway, the point about Casper is that it was a way that my imagination could think about my soul, because it sort of looks like this steamy, vaporous, blob. It's within the body and hidden and invisible most of the time, but it can be separated out and cause all the hijinks that the Ghostbusters have to sort of deal with. Now, that is a view of the soul that is not entirely agreed upon. That's a debate in the Western tradition. For example, Plato was a Pythagorean. And being a Pythagorean, he believed in reincarnation. And like Pythagoras, he was very impressed with the idea that mathematics was a kind of reality that was eternal. Because 2 plus 2 is 4, like forever. Like it will be 2 plus 2 is 4 here on Earth, on the moon, on Jupiter, in another galaxy, in a million years from now, 2 plus 2 will be 4. That sort of stunned Pythagoras and Plato into thinking about there's a whole other reality that's much more permanent than this world, which is always changing and, it submits to generation and corruption. And so they argued that the soul, it's stuck in the material world. Plato even says it's sort of entombed there. But it eventually can get out of the material world, and then it's really more of this mathematical world of eternal forms. And so for that tradition, the soul is immaterial, and it's much more like a kind of entity, like a number. And it's divine, too. Just like God lasts forever, numbers last forever, and the part of you that's divine is this immaterial soul. So that is a very influential idea from Plato. It goes to Neoplatonism. It has a big influence on St. Augustine, but it doesn't become the dominant view in Christianity, for example, because after Plato comes Aristotle. And you may know that Aristotle was Plato's student, and he was compared, I think Plato compared him to a foal, a baby horse that's just born and starts kicking its mother, because he thought that Aristotle, who he nicknamed the mind or the reader, there's some debate about what the nickname meant. He said his favorite pupil, Aristotle, basically disagreed with all of his ideas and sort of rebelled against the teacher, Plato. I think it was kind of a loving hostility between the two, sort of a father-son relationship between Plato and Aristotle. In any case, Aristotle had this different view of the soul. So this is important with regard to animals. So track this, because do animals have souls is a very interesting question. Aristotle says that there are 3 kinds of souls. So first you start out like a plant, and he calls this the vegetative soul. So if you look at plants, they grow, and they take in nutrition, they excrete byproducts, and they grow. So that's the nutritive soul, or the vegetative soul, and that's the base level. Then there's a next level up, which is animals. Animals have what's called a sensate soul, according to Aristotle. They can move around, they have locomotion, and they can sense things and read the environment through the sensory apparatus. So that's the second tier up. And then finally, there's a third tier up, which is the rational soul. And that intellectual soul only human beings have. That's what makes human beings different from any other animal, according to Aristotle. Now, what's really interesting about that view of the soul is that that was also how he understood human beings' development. And amazingly, the church also accepted this for a very long time. For example, Aristotle noticed that when you dissect animals, whether it's another mammal or a human being, you will see that in the womb, in the uterus, first what happens is you get this little blob that's rooted into the uterine wall. And Aristotle looked at that and said, that's basically when human beings are plants. We're basically like, we have a vegetative soul at that point. We're much more like a plant when we're first basically gestating within our mother. And then that basically grows into what clearly looks like an animal and is experiencing sort of pain and pleasure with, in utero. And he says that's when the human being has become an animal and has a sensate soul. And he argues that it's sometime later, like in what we would call like the second trimester, when the intellectual faculties of reason emerge. Now, much later, St. Aquinas looks at this and he says, aha, that's when God, he uses Aristotle's idea, but he sort of Christianizes it. And he says that's when God puts the soul into the human being. It's in this second trimester, and it's the rational ability of the human being. Quick side note, that also meant that abortion was actually not considered murder by the church until like the second trimester, because you didn't have a human being until after the soul had been added, or the rational soul had been added, and that didn't happen until later. Now, that was all changed in the 19th century. I think it was Pope Gregory changed this in like the 1880s or 1890s. And ever since, Catholics take the position that you have a human being right at conception. But that has not been the case historically within Catholicism. So anyway, back to our main plot, which is now, do animals have souls? Here's an interesting thing I found about Catholic dogma, and this is very interesting. These are the official teachings of the church. Okay, I'm going to read to you. I'm going to quote the renowned Dr. Ludwig Ott, whose fundamentals of Catholic dogma just break it down. He says, "Do animals go to heaven?" Seems like a reasonable question. Every kid asks this when their pet dies. But Dr. Ott says, quote, "The animal's sensitive soul is not immaterial, rational, or immortal." So he says, yes, animals have the nutritive soul, or the vegetative soul, and they have the sensate soul, but they don't have the third ingredient of the rational soul. And that's the immortal part, because it deals with the immaterial, like the forms, the idea of the good, the idea of the beautiful, justice, numbers. It's the thing that can understand God and is a kind of spark of God even. That's the sort of divine intellectual soul. And Dr. Ott says, no, animals don't have it. Now, who is he, Dr. Ott? He then says, animals are not capable of moral acts. They don't do good or evil. And so they can't merit reward or punishment. Now, this is an interesting argument, one that I'm all for animal heaven and animal immortality, by the way. I have no idea whether it exists, but I'm all for it on principle. But Dr. Ott has an interesting point here, which is how can you be rewarded or punished if you don't have free will and you don't make choices of your own free will? And he seems to be suggesting that animals don't have this ability. That raises a very interesting question, of course, for babies as well. And that was a huge problem in the West, in the sort of Abrahamic religions. What do we do with babies who die young and have not sort of developed? For Christians, it was they hadn't been baptized. But for everybody, it was a question of what is their moral status? If there's an afterlife, are they punished because they have original sin? Or are they treated as perfectly innocent and they go shoot straight to heaven? Or do we get some middle territory of limbo in between? But then Dr. Ott poses a sort of vaguely optimistic possibility. He says, quote, "God will create a new heaven and a new earth." And that's sort of him quoting the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. He could populate it with animals if he so wills, but St. Thomas Aquinas argues convincingly that there is no need for it. So this is obviously a tradition between Aristotle, Aquinas, and all the way up to Dr. Ott. And then finally, Dr. Ott finishes off, "Nothing with a corruptible nature will exist in heaven." Well, okay, he's got us there. Whatever heaven is, it does seem to be an immaterial place. Of course, in the mythological tradition and in the folk tradition, it's not an immaterial place. That's sort of how the afterworld is understood after it's gone through the gauntlet of philosophical critique through Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, all the way down to the present. But in any case, it's this interesting question. Is your dog going to go to heaven? According to this tradition, no. Because it's the sensate soul and the vegetative soul that stop with the body, and only things with an immaterial intellectual soul will basically go on to the next life. In the 12th century, an Andalusian Muslim philosopher, very famous, that we call Averroes, and whose name in Arabic would be Ibn Rushd. He argued, by looking at Aristotle and preserving Aristotelian ideas, he said, well, look, Aristotle thinks that the soul dies with the body. It's a purely material thing. It's kind of like the physiology or the functioning of the body. But just like when the eye dies, the function of seeing is over, so too when the body dies, the soul is over. It's good while we're alive because it's the thing that's making us, active and moving us around in the world and giving us physiological powers, making us different from a rock. But ultimately, as a function of material, it dies when the material dies. And so Averroes had this big influence and created this kind of huge debate about what is the status of the soul. Even within Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, there's been a long-standing debate. It's not been a unified viewpoint at all. So for example, after Averroes, you get a wonderful Italian philosopher named Pietro Papanazzi. And Pietro Pomponazzi makes his sort of name in Padua, and he's much later. I think he dies around 1525, so he's sort of a Renaissance figure. But Pomponazzi resuscitates Averroes's idea that maybe the soul is more like the seeing is to the eye. It's just the functioning of the body. And he gives a couple of interesting arguments. He says, the reason for thinking that is that your mind is never independent of the senses. Like when you think about things, it's always bound up with how you learned about them through the five senses. We don't seem to have this pure mind, maybe in certain kinds of mathematical operations, but he thinks the intellect is always connected to the body. So therefore, there's no reason to think there's some kind of other intellect that you have that will go on afterwards. And then he gives another very interesting argument where he says, besides, it's actually more virtuous to get rid of the idea of the immortal soul, because if you're only doing good acts so that your soul will be rewarded in heaven, then you're basically just a selfish, egoistic person. It's just that you're waiting to get your reward later in life. You're not doing it for the sake of the good. You're doing it so you're going to get rewards and avoid the hellfire and avoid punishment. So you're still just a selfish person. So Pomponazzi says if you get rid of the soul idea, then you'll do good things for their own sake rather than for something you can get out of it. Now that was not looked upon well by the church, and the Pope considered this idea of a kind of material soul to be a heresy, and he said as much while Pomponazzi was alive. And interestingly, Pomponazzi sort of adjusted his viewpoint. So he said, okay, look, according to reason and science and philosophy, it doesn't look like the soul exists, or at least we don't see evidence for it. But, he says, we know from Scripture that the soul is supposed to be immortal, so we should privilege Scripture over our rationality, which was a very nice way for him to get away with his heretical viewpoint and sort of distance himself from the heretical viewpoint and put himself back in good graces. Some people have looked at this and said he was a crypto-atheist. He just couldn't come clean, given the time during the age that he lived in. There's some debate about that. Some people lump him in with somebody like Montaigne. But in any case, it's a great way of seeing that even within the religious tradition, people were debating. There's also one other sort of interesting point about this too, between Averroes and Pomponazzi in this period. Is the soul an individual thing that you have that's different from me, or is it some kind of universal thing that we tap into? And that was a big debate at that time. I believe Averroes and Pomponazzi toyed with the idea that the soul was really more like not an individuated thing, but a kind of universal power that we sort of accessed. Dr. Ott, however, from our Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, says, the soul is individual. He says, quote, each person has an individual soul. That human soul is immortal, and the individual soul is created ex nihilo by God. So Dr. Ott is laying down the dogma line here, and he thinks that Scripture will not back up the idea of a kind of universal soul. It's only an individual soul. Individualism is so strong in the West that they even had to make sure that the soul was going to be an individual and not sort of a collective. Very interesting. Many of you, like myself, are fascinated by Hinduism and Buddhism, and there's some confusion on this question because they look similar to the neophyte. Hinduism has a soul idea, which basically is Atman, and it goes through many lifetimes in reincarnation until eventually it gets off the wheel of becoming and rejoins God or Brahman. And sometimes you'll see Buddhists talking this way, but technically speaking, that is not Buddhism. The Buddha critiques the soul idea, very similar, and of course, obviously centuries before our Italian Pietro Pomponazzi, but very similar kind of arguments. The Buddha says, okay, he's talking to the Brahmin teachers and the yogis of his era. This is like the 6th century BC. And he says, show me this soul. Where is it? And they're like, well, we don't really see it anywhere, but it exists. And he's like, I don't think so. And he also says, very similar argument that I just sketched by Pomponazzi. He says, think about the soul as fire. Hindu Brahmin are saying that the fire will go on after I die. But when have you ever seen fire existing by itself. He says, fire always burns on fuel of some kind. It's either wood or it's dung or something. Fire is always on a substrate of some kind. And so he gives this argument in the early scriptures, the Tripitaka, the Potapada Sutta of the Tripitaka. So this is very early Buddhism. And he says, since you never see fire burning on its own, it's always connected to fuel, that's how we should understand the soul. He says the soul is always connected to the body. It's like the fire, but when the body dies, that's it for the fire. Like when the fuel runs out, the fire doesn't keep going. It doesn't go somewhere else and burn somewhere until you bring more wood and then it comes back and starts burning on it. So the Buddha says there really is no Atman in this way. And that becomes obviously very controversial in his era. So big debate there too. I myself kind of have a different approach to this whole set of problems. I don't ask so much about whether the soul exists like in a scientific way. Weighing the soul just seems like a category mistake to me, but whatever. I mean, if you can find the funding for it, go for it. But I sort of think about it a little bit more like how the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein thought about it. Wittgenstein said, you want to understand how to think about something, look at how people actually talk about it. What is their ordinary language use of it? It's true that, there's a technical language in the sciences, and we should defer to the scientists on what is a quark or, a neutrino. But soul is not like that, Wittgenstein thinks. He says you look at how people use language and you'll see the game that's afoot. So how do people actually use soul talk? Well, they'll say things like, I found my soulmate, or that nature hike was really good for my soul. There is a sense in which people seem to be saying, this is my essential self, or these are the most important values that I have, or I'm trying to express something that's like essential rather than accidental about myself. And so we use this language. And also, when we want to hold on to someone who we love, who's passed away or moved away, or just we've lost them in our lives, then there's a sense in which grief reaches out and tries to hold on to something. And I think that something are the set of ideas and memories and emotions surrounding that person. And we sort of reify that, or what philosophers call thingify that, into something that we can hold within our mind's eye and sort of celebrate as being the essential person. So I think that this is still a valuable way to talk and use the idea of the soul. Whether it exists or not is one thing, but I think using it as a meaningful concept in our lives is still very much the case. So I think it's kind of not a descriptive way of thinking about a person, but a kind of aspirational or poetic way of thinking about a person or thinking about ourselves. And in that sense, it does good work. It's therapeutic. It helps us understand ourselves. It gives us sort of a sense of agency amidst all the change of life and so forth. So it's sort of psychologically valuable, I think. And who's going to disagree with James Brown when he says, I got soul and I'm super bad? Okay, I'm glad you were able to hang out with me for this discussion of the soul. I thank the Patreon members who voted for this. I appreciate your support. All of us here really love the Patreon subscribers, and we encourage all of you to head over to Patreon and subscribe for extra goodies. All right, until next time, Curiosifers, always stay curious. See you then.